Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina.
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on predictive coding, which is one of my favorite topics.
Yes.
So I will first just explain a little bit about sense perception and predictive coding. So sense perception is how us as humans perceive the external environment and stimuli and how we integrate that information into our brains. And predictive coding is our brain trying to estimate or guess what the stimuli is. So what happens is, imagine you see a bird and your brain immediately picks up a few contextual cues, like it's the color blue and it's small, but it doesn't really know what it is yet. But because you've seen a bird before, your brain remembers more or less what it's meant to look like. And so it guesses, okay, it's a bird, even before you fully process that information. So the stimuli coming from outside to inside, we usually call that bottom up or feed forward processes. And then your brain trying to guess what it's looking at, we usually call it top down or feedback processes. Because essentially your brain is just continually trying to guess, is it a bird? Yes. Or is it a cat? No. Is it a dog? No. Is it a bird? Yes. So yeah, does that make sense?
Essentially, your brain is always one step ahead of you.
Yeah. And
it's always doing way more work than you think it is. You only sort of experience the output of it all.
Yeah. And this gives rise to a lot of questions, such as, what is reality? Are we just solipsistic in nature? Or is it a controlled hallucination?
Yes, I came across a quote by a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. He said, your experience, Andy Clark is his name, said, you experience in some sense the world that you expect to experience, which sums up predictive coding. And then all experience is controlled hallucination.
Yes.
In his words.
Also, Frith said that predictive coding may also be the result of fantasies coinciding with reality, which is another way of saying what you just said.
Idea. Yeah, because I think I've always questioned so much how much we can trust our reality.
Yes, and how subjective everything is.
Yeah, and obviously we can't be sure of anybody else's experience is the same as our own.
Yeah.
I think a really good example of this I was literally discussing with somebody yesterday is the perception of color.
Yes.
Because what is red? What is redness? Can we define it? No.
Yeah.
Can we be certain that other people experience the same thing? I know this is a very talked about concept, but it's just the perfect example of
definitely
an element that we sensory perceive.
Yeah, we
perceive sensorily.
Yes.
I'm definitely making up words now. But that is so subjective.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that red, for example, has a specific wavelength, but then, we may all have different perspectives.
Yeah, perception is a very hard word to say.
And so, going into this, George B. Keller and Thomas Mcflogel, I hope I'm saying it correctly, they want to ask and try to answer the question, how does the brain distinguish between self-generated and externally generated sensory input, and how we perceive our external environment in the first place? So this is where predictive coding comes along. And predictive coding is a hard topic to study. There are a lot of theoretical models on it, but it's very difficult to actually conduct, biology-based experiments because it can be so ephemeral and subjective. And how can we extract quantitative data out of something that is so subjective?
Yeah.
It's
So isn't the best way to study something as complex as this by studying where it goes wrong?
Yes, that is a great point. And that is why sometimes schizophrenia and autism models are used.
Yes, I've heard about this, yeah.
Which, so essentially, well, first I would like to preface this by saying that there are a lot of different causes to autism and schizophrenia. But there is one thing that I would like to point out, which is there is a gene that is responsible, I guess, for schizophrenia or autism, because if it goes wrong one way or another, it either produces too much protein or too little of another. And so I think if it's too much, it can lead to schizophrenia, which is where you may have a stronger top-down process. So an example of this is hallucinations. That's when you're very much in your head, and the internal stimuli, let's call it, are very strong.
Yeah, it's very obvious that you're hallucinating your reality because you are hallucinating.
Yes. And so that's an example of a very strong top-down process. And in autism, it's the opposite. Autism is very sensitive to external stimuli. It's very sensitive to stimuli that it's not expecting, such as surprises. And so that has a very strong bottom-up bottom-up process. So yeah, these are really good models to study and look into where predictive coding goes wrong, or when there's too much or too little predictive coding, and what that leads to.
For some scientific context, schizophrenia and autism are both neurodevelopmental disorders that are often viewed as sort of opposite ends of similar spectrum, because they both involve changes at the molecular level that converge onto structures known as synapses, which are the connections between neurons. And so this is why they're often talked about like in the same context, schizophrenia and autism, because they often sort of oppose each other in how they work, such as in the case of predictive coding.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a protein that is increased in one and decreased in the other.
Yeah, it's a growth hormone that in schizophrenia there's too much because the gene is turned off, and in autism there's too little.
Right. So as far as my understanding, I think there are more than one example of proteins such as this. Because I was then going to ask if you think this underlies the differences in predictive coding, but I feel like that might be a simplification.
Well, it's definitely one of the avenues to look into. It's definitely like a great disease model to look into. But I think it would be a bit too soon to be certain that this is it, just because there's been a few other experiments, such as by Andrea Bastos and Earl K. Miller, which are based in MIT, and they've done an experiment that looks at different waves brainwaves and how we know now that alpha and beta waves may be associated with predictive coding, whereas gamma is more associated with bottom-up processes, I believe.
So gamma... Oh, okay, right. So gamma brainwaves sort of underlie the initial the initial processing of the sensory input that we receive, whereas the alpha and beta are in control of the predictions that occur within the brain.
Yeah, it's more that the alpha and beta are more present in pathways which are prepared to receive expected stimuli. So if I'm looking at a candle, and because I've just lit a candle and I look at it again, I'm expecting to see a candle. So alpha and beta waves, they are responsible for that like expectation. Whereas gamma is more if I light a candle and then I look back and I don't know, I see a glass of water. That's surprising.
Yeah.
That would be more gamma. So yeah,
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I guess not much is understood about the brainwaves except for correlations to behaviors such as this.
Yeah.
But
it's definitely like an interesting experiment that
Yeah.
they've done. Another way to research predictive coding has been done by Jasper Poort, based in Cambridge, which has done some really cool experiments where he propped up these mice on
prop them up.
yes, on these like wheels, so they could like run on top of the wheel.
Oh, like the virtual reality.
Yeah, exactly. And then they had they attached like a VR set onto them, and so what would happen is they would run, and then the VR set would also make it appear like they were running.
Yeah.
But then sometimes the VR set did not match their movements, so sometimes they'd be running and the VR set would be as if they would be not running.
Yeah. So it's sort of just, you're just trying to trick the mouse, you know, just confuse them as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so this was very interesting because it's such a clear way of seeing what the brain expects to see and what happens when that stimuli isn't matched.
Yeah, when there's unexpected stimuli.
Yeah. So yeah, this was a really good experiment to see how disjuncted reality affects your brain and whether or not it's capable of conducting predictive coding.
This actually reminds me of something I came across. Not only can you study it through disorders like autism and schizophrenia, but also through psychedelic experiences. Because psychedelic experiences are obviously characterized by hallucinations. So you would sort of expect, predictive coding wise, it to follow the same thing as schizophrenia, which is too much prediction. Yeah. But actually, instead, I don't know how this was found, but I read that psychedelic substances remove the predictive filter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that we no longer predict. And this leads to the hallucinations, or maybe we shouldn't be calling them hallucinations.
No, maybe that is actually reality.
Exactly, that's what I thought. But the interesting thing is it's not just reality, it's the fact that we can then see multiple realities. So because of lack of prediction, we start to see the multiple equally real possibilities of what reality could be. Maybe does that make sense?
It does, but like, wait, wouldn't it just be reality unfiltered? How is it multiple realities?
Maybe reality unfiltered is multiple realities, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. I'm so fascinated by this.
What if, like, taking these, like, psychedelics is allowing us to see reality? So, like, why aren't we taking psychedelics then?
That's actually an interesting point, because when I was I read Michael Pollan's book called How to Change Your Mind.
I love Michael Pollan.
Yes, he is such a good science writer.
Yeah.
But this book was basically a brief history of psychedelics.
Yeah.
And what I came to really realize and understand is that, you know how there was a surge of psychedelics in the 1960s in that period. The reason it then became completely banned, classed as a Schedule I drug, just seen as a horrendous drug that people who don't know much about drugs just believe will kill you, is because of the public movement that it started in the 1960s, just the general hippie era of people not wanting to follow rules anymore.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting how that just didn't fit, the way that societies were built, which is through regulations. And anyways, I know this is such a tangent from predictive coding.
It's so interesting.
But I find it really interesting because obviously that is a very valid question. If psychedelic drugs, by removing this predictive filter, so let us transition back to predictive coding, enables us to see reality or realities.
Yes. Oh, that
Yeah.
is so interesting. I really would expect psychedelics to increase the predictive coding
I know.
massively.
Yeah, I definitely am interested to find out how they came to this conclusion.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure it was so difficult to study considering what we've been discussing.
Yeah.
But also linked to this is the interesting point of the effects on anxiety and depression alleviated by psychedelics may be because of this, at a cognitive level, because of this removal of prediction.
Yeah.
So in anxiety, for example, you stop predicting future scenarios. You stop predicting, and then in depression, you stop predicting your future selves. So this is sort of predictive coding moving away from sensory perception, more prediction in a general context of cognition. But I think it's still linked.
It's definitely still linked because it's internally generated, reactions and emotions which aren't caused by an external stimuli, but it's caused by, let's say, an internal stimuli, like your thoughts.
Yeah.
Which goes back to, one of the main questions, which is how can we distinguish what is internally generated and what is an external stimuli.
Yeah.
Another interesting study done by Natalie Rochefort, which is based in Edinburgh.
Yes.
She conducted a study looking at food scarcity and how it relates to coding precision. So the brain is 2% of the body mass, and the human brain consumes 20% of the caloric energy intake, and the cortex uses 50% of this energy. Isn't that crazy?
That is very crazy.
Essentially, 10% of the energy is consumed by the cortex. That's a massive amount for this one region of the brain.
Yeah.
And so...
No wonder the cortex has so much attention when it comes to research.
So what she noticed with this food scarcity experiment is that it led to less accurate predictive coding. And so from what I understood of this study, it meant that there would therefore be stronger top-down processes. Once predictive coding is hindered or removed, all you're left with is
just direct sensory perception, no more prediction.
Yeah, exactly. And
so that kind of makes sense in terms of efficiency. So when you're scarce of food, you need to conserve your energy. Yeah. So probably predictive coding is a very energy
it is very energy
process.
Consuming. Yeah, definitely. And that's what she found. And you could argue that then maybe predictive coding isn't essential.
Oh yeah, definitely. It seems perhaps it could be also that the examples of like autism, schizophrenia, psychedelics, very human specific.
Definitely.
So
yes.
Also, I know there's been a surge of research recently in predictive coding and its links with consciousness studies and how we can understand consciousness through understanding predictive coding.
Yeah, that's kind of tied to what I was going to say next. So if predictive coding isn't essential, if it's not essential for survival, could it be to what it leads to consciousness? And could this be the switch that turns on the lights of consciousness, you know?
Yeah.
And it also made me think a lot about... So this whole experiment made me think a lot about our previous topic, evolution, which Clara touched upon. And
yes, which I am obsessed with.
Yes. So, Clara, you mentioned macaques have like more robust firing in neurons.
Yeah, exactly. Their neurons can be described as more robust. So meaning they essentially fire more frequently and more reliably in response to stimuli. Yeah. Whereas human neurons were described as more efficient in the same study, meaning that they might not respond to stimuli all the time, but when they do, it's because it's necessary.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because it also means that macaques have less predictive coding and in their robustness. So it's tied
to... It could mean.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Apologies!
No, as in, because because I think it's so, we always tend to want to, I always want to at least link like the level of the neuron to the level of the system.
Of course.
And it often can be, it's often mirrored, but yeah, we're making assumptions here, just full disclaimer.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're speculating a lot.
Yes.
On these studies that have been made.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
but yeah, the fact that the macaque neurons respond robustly is definitely linked to the process, the process of sensory perception, as you described, whereas a more efficient way of neuronal processing could be linked to the predictive coding aspect, because there's just more. Also, something I mentioned in line with human neurons being more efficient is that this is likely linked to the fact that there's more local processing inside a single neuron.
Yeah.
And so this may also be linked to the predictive coding that occurs in the brain.
Definitely. It's
there's
so
just
fascinating.
There's more processing of the
There just keeps being more and more layers. Like,
yeah.
Predictive coding never ends. There's always something related to predictive coding, whether it's psychedelics or disorders or, you know, basic survival mode. You know.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, how in survival mode, quote unquote, predictive coding gets reduced. It kind of makes us wonder, like, why it's there in the first place.
Actually, this reminds me of something that really interests me, because my main research interest is learning and memory. And something I came across is that predictive coding needs to be changed in the processes of learning versus memory. So when you learn something new, and again, this is not really sensory perception predictive coding, but more like cognitive higher function prediction. But if you're learning something new, your predictive mechanism must be reduced to like receive the new information, you know, without putting your own interpretation of it.
Initially, you have the bottom-up process, the feed-forward.
Exactly. Actually, this does link to sensory perception. If you're learning what that bird looks like that you described, a beautiful blue bird, you need to not put your own perception of the bird yet. You just need to like take in the information. Whereas in order to shift a new piece of information into your memory storage, you need a predictive model of the information to integrate that information into.
Oh, wow.
And so our brains need to, you need to have like an optimal balance between the learning and memory, lack of prediction, full of prediction. To function.
This is so amazing.
Yeah.
And it kind of ties back into how everything is so subjective.
Yeah.
So the way that you store a memory is incredibly subjective, but then the way that you react whenever you see that same stimuli has a degree of subjectivity. And I would be very interested in trying to research or, answering the question of, to what extent is an individual subjective? I know that there are factors that can contribute to that, such as whether you're tired or under like the influence of alcohol, you'll have a more subjective experience of life. But if there was a way to quantify it and to know exactly what were the feed forward, what were the feedback, and what is the space in between, that could be the subjectiveness.
Yeah, so what Carolina is saying is that she wants to tackle arguably the most difficult question to answer in neuroscience.
No, I don't know. I just like prodding at
subjectivity through science, which was built to be objective.
I'm challenging the objectiveness of science.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening. And if you have any opinions or if you've come across any interesting research to do with predictive coding, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
So do please reach out on the social media.
Definitely. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.